Ladies, gentlemen, Speakerhead Squad, what is going on? It is your boy Speakerhead and welcome back to another video. When it comes to Transformer collecting, I love figures of all different shapes and sizes. But there's one specific line that I see gets a lot more hate than the rest, and that's going to be Hasbro's Core Class line of figures. So today I wanted to bring up the question, are Core Class figures worth buying? But before we get into this question, if you enjoy any of this sort of content, make sure to like and subscribe. It really does help me out. Also, friendly reminder that one like equals one pat for my little buddy Doug here. Say hi, Doug. Also, if you enjoy any of the music in this video or just want to support the channel in general, it's all part of my royalty-free music label, Speakerhead Studios. All the music on this label is completely royalty-free, so go ahead and use it for any of your content creating needs. Finally, I want to mention if you ever want to catch me live, I do stream over at Speakerhead Live on YouTube. But now that we got all that out of the way, let's get into the question, are Core Class figures worth buying? So to start this off, I want to talk about some of the positives of Core Class figures. And the first one I'm going to bring up right away is going to be the price of them. Each one of these guys is only about $10, and that's a pretty good deal for any Transformer figure. In fact, there's not going to be many figures that you're going to find cheaper than this. And even at this price point, many of these figures have great qualities to them. And that brings me to my next positive on these guys, and that's going to be the sculpt of them. Now when it comes to Core Class figures, it's a toss-up whether it's going to be a good sculpt for a figure or not. And from what I've seen, I think it really depends on if the character is supposed to be small or not. Some example of Core Class figures with good sculpts are going to be Studio Series Spike, Studio Series Wheelie, and Soundwave's cassette minions that have been released so far. This is excluding that Core Class Dark of the Moon laser beak. That doesn't really count. Because let's be honest, they only made that because they're going to make that into a Bumblebee at some point. Talking about Studio Series Spike and Wheelie, I think both of them have a pretty decent sculpt. And I honestly do think it has to do because these characters are supposed to be small. Because these characters are already small, they can have a fairly simple transformation and focus more on sculpt. Unlike some of the figures I'll talk about in a sec where they have to take a larger figure and make it into a smaller one. And some examples of these figures are going to be the Core Class Megatron, Core Class Hot Rod, and so far all the Core Class Dinobots. Starting with Megatron, due to the limitation of the budgets, he has a really large backpack that just looks ugly. And then his shoulder pads do limit his arm movement quite a bit, which does make it difficult to get him into some decent poses. Then the other example I brought up was going to be Core Class Hot Rod. And this figure is what I consider to be the worst Core Class figure that's been released so far. And this for numerous reasons, but one of those reasons is going to be the sculpt of this guy. To start off, his legs are a big, chunky, but hollow mess. And then if you want to rotate his arms straight, his shoulder pads unplugs his backpack. And then I personally just don't like the overall sculpt of this guy. This is more of a personal thing, but I just don't really like the overall sculpt. Then finally moving on to my last example of all the Core Class Dinobots. Now with these guys, I do want to mention why their sculpt is so bad is because they are supposed to combine together. Many people have theorized that they're going to do a remold of it into a different character in the future. But because of this combining factor, these Core Class figures are extra chunky. And let's be honest, the overall sculpt of these guys are pretty terrible. But I feel like many people are giving them a pass due to that combining factor. Because that is extra engineering that does have to be put into these little guys on that tight budget. Which, don't get me wrong, I completely understand, but let's be honest, they do look pretty bad. But as I said before, even though these Core Class figures that I mentioned kind of stink, their larger counterparts are all pretty great. In fact, the Voyager class version of Hot Rod, even though he is a deluxe, but we'll get into that maybe some other day, this figure was nominated one of the best figures that Hasbro released for that year. Which brings me back to my point of why I think smaller characters work better for Core Class. Then coming to my final positive for these guys, and that's something that I don't see people mention too much, but they're just fun figures to mess around with. So far I've picked up almost every single Core Class figure, and every single one that I've owned I've really enjoyed messing around with. Yeah, they might not look the greatest, but you can still get some of them in some decent poses. And then transforming every single one of these figures is super simple and something you can do within a minute or so. Once again, this is something I want to mention because I feel like this is something people don't talk about too much. Usually when they're talking about a figure, they're talking about the paint, sculpt, and posability of it. And when it comes to Core Class, do they have the greatest articulation? No. Do they have the greatest paint job? No. Do they have the best sculpts out there? No. But do any of those things make it not a fun figure? No. These little Core Class figures have a nice charm to them that just make them really fun figures to mess around with. But now that we talked about positives for these guys, let's get into a couple negatives. And to start off negatives, let's talk about paint job for these guys. So the overall paint on these guys is fairly lacking on most of them. However, there are a few such as Studio Series Rumble that do have a decent amount of paint on them, including their accessories. But for the most part, a lot of these figures are lacking in the paint department. And once again, this is where I'm going to talk about Core Class Hot Rod because this once again is my least favorite Core Class figure. So what I personally hate about this guy the most is the paint job on this guy. I think for the alt mode they did an okay job, it is missing some paint in some parts. But when it comes to the robot mode, Hasbro didn't care about putting any paint on this guy. As I stated before, I understand it's probably for budget issues, but once again, it just looks terrible. That's why personally me and other people have taken it upon ourselves to do our own paint jobs to this guy to make him look better. And I will admit, if you do add some paint details to this guy, he does look much better. But the fact that some of these details such as the silver wasn't already added kind of makes me mad. Because without this custom paint job, this guy really doesn't look like Hot Rod in his robot mode. Yeah, the mold looks like him, but it looks like a cheap knockoff. But like I said before, that's the main reason why I don't like this Hot Rod figure. Then the second negative I see on most of these figures is their lack of articulation. So as I stated with my previous example of Core Class Megatron, his arm articulation isn't the greatest. And that's generally due to the sculpt of the shoulder pads. But he's not the only figure that has some articulation issues. Another one that comes to mind is the Studio Series Shockwave. This guy's got pretty basic articulation overall, but when he's holding his gun, he really isn't able to bend his elbow at all, which sucks. It's not a huge gripe, but I wish it didn't get in the way of the elbow. Then going back to our good old friend Core Class Hot Rod, his articulation sucks as well. The most you can really do with his legs are spread him apart, and that's if the lower legs don't come untabbed. Then as I said before, if you put his arms straight, his backpack comes untabbed. And then this might just be an issue on mine, but his shoulders don't really want to sit in the same position. They're not loose, but they don't want to actually line up together. And this is really annoying because I usually have one shoulder that's always higher than the other. And then my final example of this is going to be Studio Series Rumble. And for the most part, his articulation is fine, but for some reason they just decided to give him no elbow articulation at all. And some of you might be thinking it's not that big of a deal to be missing one point of articulation, but honestly, it's a pretty important part to be missing. When it comes to posing any of my figures, I always have the elbows bent at least a little bit. So the fact that this guy's always got to be straight armed really just bugs me. And this is why I keep the pile drivers on mine, which I know most people will do anyway. But it still does bug me that they didn't decide to add any articulation there, considering how small of a figure he is as well. Currently, he is the smallest Core Class figure that's been released so far, but that's mainly just because he's supposed to fit in Soundwave's chest. And I think it also has to do with the fact that they did a lot of remolding from the Siege version of Rumble. I think they just did a little extra retooling, added some extra paint, and gave him his pile drivers, and that's all they did. Which is annoying because this is probably going to be the best Rumble we're going to be getting from Hasbro anytime soon. But overall, our articulation of most of these Core Class figures isn't terrible, but a lot of them do have some issues. But now let's answer the question that I asked at the beginning: are Core Class figures worth buying? And my answer to this is to buy the figures that fit into your collection. Some of the smaller Core Class characters such as Wheeler or Spike will fit excellent into your main line and possibly your Masterpiece collection. And the reason why I mentioned Masterpiece is because I think these guys could possibly fit into there as well. They are a little small, but I think they do look pretty good with your Masterpiece figures. And in case you can't get your hands on the X-Transbots version of Wheelie, I think that the Core Class version will work just fine. And then for Core Class Spike, I think he's better in a lot of ways than the one that comes with the Masterpiece Bumblebee. Yeah, there are some features that are missing from the Core Class version compared to the Masterpiece version, but it's the same both ways. Plus you can get the Core Class Exosuit in a much more natural position compared to the Masterpiece version. Then for Legend Scale collectors such as myself, I think that some Core Class figures will fit into your collection. And oh my gosh, why do we keep talking about this figure? But in all seriousness, if you need a Hot Rod for your Legend Scale collection, I think that this Core Class Hot Rod could possibly work for it. You'll definitely have to add some paint to this guy, but he actually does scale pretty well with Magic Square figures. But I do also want to mention that even if you don't buy these guys specifically for your collection, that if you just pick these guys up, they are really fun figures to get. Like I said, I've owned a lot of these Core Class figures, and I really haven't had a place to put them in my collections. But I did pick a lot of them up, and I did have a good time with them, even if I did end up getting rid of some. So even though these Core Class figures aren't for everyone, I think that some of these guys are hidden gems, and I feel like you should try to pick up at least one to mess around with. But guys, that's going to be my thoughts on Core Class figures. Let me know what you think down below. Let me know if you own some Core Class figures, or let me know if you plan on picking some up. But once again, if you enjoyed this content, make sure to like and subscribe. It really does help me out. And once again, friendly reminder that 1 like equals 1 pat for my little buddy Doug. Finally, once again, if you enjoyed any of the music in this video or just want to support the channel in general, it's all part of my royalty-free music label, Speaker Studios, link in the description. But that's going to be it for me, guys. I appreciate you checking out the video, and I'll catch all y'all in the next one. Peace!